Thank you all for joining us, for joining the Ecological Landscape Alliance. We are an organization that was founded in 1992, as you probably all know, and are a leader in promoting sustainable approaches to landscape design, construction, and management. Our commitment to innovative ideas and evidence-based practices has made this organization both a trusted and valuable resource, and there has been a vibrant community of landscape professionals that are devoted to our mission, vision, and values. ELA's members are growing and include the following specialists: arborists, community activists, conservation agencies and commissioners, ecologists, educators, engineers, federal, state, and city town personnel, irrigation specialists, garden coaches, gardening enthusiasts, land planners, land architects, land designers, landscape professionals, landscape contractors, lawn care professionals, watershed personnel, and wetland scientists. So there is a place for everybody where we all care about what happens on the land and use an ecological approach to our work on the land. I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Pamela Bursler, who is a nationally recognized expert on soil and water management, who developed the Watershed approach, a regenerative landscape strategy, and grew it into a nationwide movement with 12 guidebooks on the subject. Agencies and municipalities throughout the Western United States have adopted its principles as their landscape standards. For 15 years, Ms. Bursler has helmed G3, Green Gardens Group, an award-winning EPA professional certifying organization. Prior to G3, Ms. Bursler spent a decade as a licensed landscape contractor with an award-winning bespoke design build firm. She is the recipient of three Environmental Protection Agency annual professional awards, the Garden Writers Association Green Medal for Sustainability, and APLD's International Sustainability Award. She is also a graduate of the Al Gore-sponsored Climate Reality Training and Speaker Corps. Ms. Bursler didn't come to landscape and agriculture through a direct route, though, as she took a detour through a career in derivative securities, trading, and raising private equity for technology and media companies. Pamela is deeply committed to the reinvigoration of American entrepreneurship through regenerative land management and agriculture. So help me welcome Pamela, and thank you so much for being here, especially since you are enjoying time in England. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peggy. I am delighted to be here. I'm going to go right to the heart of the matter. Voila. So hello, everybody. I am really delighted to be here. The talk I'm going to give today is an update of a talk that I gave at the ELA conference. I think it was in February of this year. And so we're going to go both on a macro scale and then also down to a micro scale with some actual strategies. But I want to try to put things into perspective. And one of the things that I kind of want to start off with is, and I've been thinking about this a lot recently, is, we are all very concerned about what's going on, right? In the environment, etc. I think the real measure of who we are as humans is going to be how we act, more so than how much we complain. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about what the issues are and how we can fix them. So I think honesty is the best policy. I'm telling you right up front that I am a tree hugger. I'm also a cow hugger, very important, and I love everything about cows. I've been spending a lot of time in regenerative agriculture recently, which is a complete surprise for me. It's something I avoided for many, many years. I've been a landscape expert, and it's an absolute joy. And it's very, very interesting to me to see how what we are doing in urban areas with landscape really parallel what needs to happen in rural areas with agriculture. And I think that what we're going to be talking about today is really a way for us to bridge a huge divide that we have in this country. Well, not this country because I'm in England, but actually in this country too, pretty much everywhere. Look, climate change does keep me sleepless. I live in Los Angeles. I worry a lot about it because basically Earth's cycles are broken. or they're breaking. And it really seems incredibly overwhelming. In order to turn things on on its head, how much time do we really have? I've heard estimates as short as a decade. And really, when you start to look at individual bits of data, because that's kind of how the media works, it focuses in on this climate catastrophe and that one after another, but it doesn't really look at it in a big picture. And when you start to look at it in a big picture, boy, you realize it's happening super fast. And really, the number one enemy that we are facing in the world is something that we call desertification. Well, maybe not this. Maybe it's more like this. Desertification is essentially a degradation of soil. And the map that you see here shows you the most vulnerable areas. Now, what's interesting about this is those of you, or most of you are, I guess, in the northeast part of the US, and you'll note that that is not really a degraded, area, or degraded area rather. But we're going to look at some maps in just a little bit that are going to show us a little bit more granularity to this kind of information. And we find that a lot of the patterns that we're seeing in places like where we originally started seeing them in the West and the Southwest, they are now translating to the Southeast, to the middle of the country, and indeed to parts of the Northeast as well. We have seen desertification here in the US. We've been seeing it for many, many, many years. It is essentially what we called the Dust Bowl was a desertification of the middle of our country. And lest we think that it was only something that was going on in, the 30s, let us look to the pictures from just, this last decade, and in fact, from this year. This is a picture in Arizona of a monsoonal dust storm, which is like freaking apocalyptic as far as I think, as far as I'm concerned. This is a dust storm happening just on the precipice of a thunderstorm. And so, essentially what begins to happen here is it's raining mud. So I don't know. I'm sure there's something very biblical about that, but it definitely is a frightening idea. And this soil death that I'm talking about, desertification, it results from the fact that we don't have soil anymore, and I'll talk about that in a second. There are no living roots in the ground, and we don't have passive rainwater catchment. We're not holding on to rainwater in our soils. And so when you put those three things together, you end up killing soil. And we end up dehydrating soil. So this is what I wanted you to take a look at. And I really encourage you, if you don't currently go to the GRACE satellite and take a look on a regular basis at what's going on in the country in terms of drought and flood and so forth. This is incredible information. It's a satellite that essentially is monitoring water, all over, but in the northern hemisphere, and it is taking measurements and comparing it to a baseline. I think it's in the 30s, the baseline, although I have to check on that. But anyway, it's a baseline from quite a long time ago, and it is measuring, what's going on with water at different levels of the soil. So it starts with groundwater and goes all the way up to surface water. Now, this is root zone water. And the reason I'm showing you this is because root zone water is really the most essential water on the planet. It's the largest freshwater supply on the planet. And it is actually the water that manages weather. So I'm always looking at root zone moisture to see, what's going on. And this is just from a couple of days ago. And you can see that we continue to have incredibly dehydrated areas, despite the fact that we are now experiencing some major storm activity, both on the East Coast and on the West Coast. You can see in some places where that storm activity has gone into root zones, but I challenge you to, look at this objectively, because you can see that there are places even within the Northeast and the Eastern Seaboard that are still dry within the root zone. And, how can that possibly be when there has been weather? When we dehydrate the soil, when we dehydrate our land, this is what it looks like in real life. The results of that are drought and are a depleted water supply. This is Lake Mead, which is the water supply for 40 plus 45 million people in the West, and 19 million people in my neck of the woods. So a lot of people rely on this water supply, and you can see where it has been. And this NASA imaging, I mean, I really, again, want to encourage you as environmental people who are interested in ecological issues and environmental issues. NASA is just doing some incredible imaging. And, you don't have to use your imagination when you're looking at this imaging. And also, I just want to say that, it's a plug in a way to whenever you hear people talking about not funding NASA missions, just keep in mind that the only way we know what's going on our planet is by, continuing to look at what's going on from space. So NASA is super important, and they kept a low profile for the last 5 or 6 years, but they're coming back. So these overheated land masses actually fuel massive storm systems that are filled with water vapor that's coming off of a warming ocean. And so what you begin to see are things like this. I'm a storm chaser. I spend, 3 weeks out of every year in the Midwest, running back and forth, trying to find not hurricanes, but trying to find tornadoes and other major storms. This is a storm. Yeah, that big wall of water is that is rain. It's a rain bomb, basically. And this is a huge amount of water that's coming out of these storms, and it's because the ocean is warming, essentially. And that's a problem. And so we find that we have these epic drought periods followed by absolute deluge. And it's wreaking havoc in our urban areas. I mean, this is a picture from today in Puerto Rico, where they are, experiencing terrible hurricane. But this picture could be anywhere in the world. I mean, we could have been in India. We could be in Riverside, California, and be showing a picture very, very similar to this. And it's not just urban areas that are affected by these deluges. Rural areas are too. This is a picture I took myself in the Midwest in the spring, after a storm period. And this is flooded. These are flooded fields. How could it possibly be that there are these big open areas and they're flooded? It's not. It's it just doesn't seem possible. But when you have that, you actually have delays in planting. The yields are reduced on these fields, and even more importantly, the soil, which is really the life's blood of our agricultural system, washes away. And so what we find is that because we have destroyed the soil really in the middle of the country, all of that soil and nutrient that has been added to that soil ends up here in the Gulf of Mexico. And that's because the water from the Midwest is part of a giant watershed. And that Mississippi River watershed, that enormous pink watershed there, it just kind of overlaps the Ogallala aquifer, which is another thing that is being depleted. That Mississippi watershed ends up down there in the Gulf of Mexico, and everything that we do to the land in any place where we have that Mississippi watershed is reflected in the health of the Gulf. And of course, many of you know about the I think it's apoxic, right? That is the lack of oxygen zones that are in the Gulf of Mexico. So very scary stuff. And that's a result really of agricultural and urban runoff. And that's happening everywhere in the world. And of course, so we have these, drought followed by deluge, the loss of all the soil, and these environmental catastrophes create climate refugees, which fuels civil unrest. This is a picture from Syria. For those of you who followed sort of the civil war in Syria, and you know how incredibly destabilizing that is. I mean, essentially, a lot of what we are seeing today in places like Ukraine and Russia, these are influenced by what happened in places like Syria. And the Syrian civil war was fueled in large part by rural areas, mass migration of people from rural areas because of drought and policies that influenced farm owners, and they migrated to cities and destabilized the whole region. And then we have world leaders essentially unable to have a backbone enough to take on the issues, and lacking self-discipline, really, especially the more the bigger economies, really, lacking self-discipline, and they are unable to govern corporate entities that are really becoming supranational. So this is a big deal. And meanwhile, all of us are consumers, and every single consumer feels the effects of this, of what's going on. The yields on food and so forth decline, and yet prices keep going up and up and up. And at the same time, the value of the food that we produce, the thing that is coming from our soil, is declining in nutritive value. So especially phytonutritive value. So, over the last 70 years, we've had a massive decline in the nutrition of our food. And what does that do? Well, that contributes to obesity, because you have to consume now 3 times as much food today in order to get the same nutritive value that you would have had in the 40s. And obesity and so forth contributes to chronic illness. I mean, the only people that really benefit from chronic illness is big pharma. So really, we have a cycle that all is coming very much comes back to what's happening in in land management. Our conventional food input prices, so the inputs that conventional farmers are putting into food, is going through the roof, mostly because they're fossil fuel based. So that's an input that's being reflected now to consumers. And there are a huge number of stressors on the agricultural rural communities, not the least of which is that despite the fact that prices are going up, debt levels are also increasing. And now the cost of debt, of course, is going up. So, I mean, really, we're in a really incredible time that the ecological issues are being reflected in the rest of our society. Individuals and communities are breaking down. The 2021 farmer suicide rate worldwide was the highest it has ever been. It's just an incredibly difficult time, and that leads to civil unrest. So all of this, civil unrest that we are seeing in the rest of the world, that we think, oh, okay, well, those environmental issues are not on our doorstep, and those wars are not on our doorstep. Well, actually, they are. They are. And the same thing that is happening in the rest of the world is actually happening here at home. The good news is we can fix it. And we may never be able to get it back to exactly what it once was. And of course, that's just the way it is. but we can certainly get ourselves back into a much better place because we believe in gardens, and that is, that's the secret, honestly. I'll talk a little bit about why I think this is not more powerfully expressed by politicians, well, not just politicians, but government and also large corporate interests and larger groups of people. The power of a garden has not yet come to the fore, but we can bring it there, and I think we need to. The biggest change that we need to make is right between our ears. I call this the epic compaction. It's the compaction that lies between our ears. We need to figure out how to think differently. And so, what if we could actually develop landscapes that could fix the Earth's broken systems? How could we do that? Well, the systems that I want to have a quick conversation about specifically are the carbon, water, nutrient, economic, governance, and community systems. They all fit together, as I just kind of tried to explain what the effects were of them breaking down. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about how each of these systems kind of functions, and then how the landscape influences each of these systems. So let's start with this. I mean, it's this is probably the best way to kind of just take a break. Okay, we just had some really nasty slides, and now we can just breathe a sigh of relief and take a look at this beautiful planet. Okay, here we are. This is what we're all about. So I'm going to ask you a question. Why don't we dress like this every day? What do you think? What's the reason that we don't have to dress like this every day? Well, of course, it's because that beautiful planet has an atmosphere. Okay. Well, what is the most abundant atmospheric gas? If you said nitrogen, you're correct. Now, oh, by the way, I just want to point out nitrogen, right? What is the largest input into agricultural systems? Fossil fuel created nitrogen. And yet, it's the most abundant atmospheric gas. So let's keep that in mind. Anyway, what's the most abundant greenhouse gas? Well, that would be water vapor. Now, water vapor, it's very important that we have a greenhouse effect um, in our environment. That's a super important thing. But it needs to be managed, and it needs to be working properly, I guess is the best thing to say, and not roasting us. So who creates the water vapor that creates this beautiful layer of greenhouse gas? Well, that would be these guys: trees, plants, and their microbial friends. The microbes that live on those plants and also at the roots of those plants are essentially creating this atmosphere that we enjoy. And we call that the soil party, that abundance of microbes that live at the roots of plants, especially. And this soil party is, it's incredibly abundant. And I know, most of you have geeked out on this, probably over the last decade, but it's really an incredible thing. I mean, the more you learn, the more amazing it becomes. For me, the whole microbial interactivity with humans and plant life and just in governance of all the systems on the planet, I mean, it never ceases to amaze me. It's always something that is infinitely beautiful, almost to the point of magical. And those microbes are found in the rhizosphere, which is this sheath around the plant roots. And there's a huge amount of biological activity that's going on there. And basically, the plants themselves are actually influencing those microbes. They are in control of their own environments they are farming microbes. And in farming microbes, they are essentially farming carbon. They are managing carbon and utilizing carbon strands in order to re-engineer their environment uh, to be optimal for them. Now, the way plants do this is through photosynthesis. Now, photosynthesis is essentially the harnessing of the solar power of the sun. Well, that's redundant, solar power, solar energy, and utilizing that solar energy to gather carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and convert uh, those carbon dioxide molecules into carbon and carbohydrate strands that they utilize to build their body and also to fuel the microbial activity at their root system. And so really these plants are expert. They have evolved to engineer their environment both above ground and below ground. Above ground, they are in their capture of CO2, they are releasing that oxygen, and they are also, as I say, creating these carbohydrate strands that they trade with the microbial community in order to create incentives for the microbial community to create food, water, and other services really for the plant. So the plant is in complete control and it's utilizing the sun in order to power this incredible biological system. Now, what the plants and microbes are doing is they are essentially creating a good soil structure because soil structure is critical to their being able to live. Now, good soil structure is demonstrated here. This is a little, sort of like a slate test that we're doing. I just want to explain it to you, though, so you kind of understand why the woman in the front would be so blissed out. So what we have here are 2 samples of soil, or actually 4 samples of soil, but from 2 different sites. On each of these 2 sites, we've gathered a sample from a compacted area where the soil structure has been destroyed, and we've gathered a sample from an area where the soil structure is as the plant has created it. And those samples were then plunged into these columns of water, and we observed what happened to that soil when it went into the water. Well, the answer is that the compacted soil, and clearly you can see the 2 tubes that are opaque, that are filled with soil. These are from the compacted sites. You can see these are clearly 2 different soil types, 2 different soil samples, 2 different places, yet they both behaved the same. They both fell apart when they went into that water because there was no structure to that soil. On the other hand, the samples that you see in the relatively clear containers, these are examples of good soil structure where the soil has been glued together into aggregates by the soil biology, which has been fed and nurtured by the plant roots. So you can see here very, very clearly that good soil structure is essentially behaving like a sponge. Now, when we have good soil structure in the ground, so in other words, we have what we call living soil. Living soil is essentially, a very diverse microbial community in the soil at the roots of plants. So we have plant roots and microbes. When we have living soil and we have plants that are, actively photosynthesizing, we make something called green water. And the way that we make this green water is essentially the soil microbial community is storing carbon. That carbon storage is what has created that beautiful soil structure that we just saw. And that stored carbon is hydrophilic. So it's holding on to water. And we call this water green water. And basically, this is a giant sponge that exists at the root zone of plants. So where we have plants and living soil, we have green water being held by those plants and by those microbes in this beautiful soil structure. Now, this is root zone water. So remember that picture that I showed you about the gray space satellite measurements of root zone water? Root zone water is green water. Green water is the water that cycles from the soil through the plants, back up into the atmosphere, back down to the soil, and so forth. Green water. Green water is, as I said, the largest fresh water supply on the planet. It's really important to remember all that, above surface storage, lakes, rivers, streams, etc., pales in comparison to green water, which is essentially groundwater, root zone water. And this is the water that essentially regulates our weather, especially over the terrestrial areas, but really it plays a role in all weather. You're like, where's this person going? Hang in there. So plants transfer this green water up into the atmosphere during photosynthesis. They are essentially cooling their leaves, cooling their bodies, so that they can continue to photosynthesize. And this is called evapotranspiration. And transpiration is this process essentially of sweating and creating like an air conditioning unit to cool down the plants, cool down the area around the plants, so that the plant solar panels, their leaves, can function in the highest efficiency range. And so they are essentially transferring that water from the soil back up into the atmosphere as water vapor. Once it's in the atmosphere as water vapor, and there's enough of it, it will find microbes in the atmosphere, which will precipitate that water back down onto the earth. So each of those drops of rain is gathering, condensing essentially around a microbe, and it's returning back to earth. So solar radiation drives this cycle as well. It's driving a cycle of water transfers from the soil microbes to the plants, from the plants to the atmosphere. The atmospheric molecules, atmospheric microbes condense the water, and it comes back down onto the soil. And all of this, too, is fueled by solar radiation. Now, when we have vegetated systems on the land, we have nice, cool terrestrial areas. And we have a very efficient water cycle where we have this vegetation. I mean, this is how you can have a rainforest, right? It's highly vegetated, it's evapotranspiring, it's condensing right there, it's nice and cool. And so this is this particular cycle of water is called a small water cycle. It's the cycle of water over a terrestrial system. The water source is green water, so root zone water, and it is a gentle water cycle that is happening over terrestrial areas. Now, before we had urban and suburban development, this small water cycle produced regular precipitation, predictable precipitation over land areas. And that was good for everything. It kept streams filled, and it kept plants growing, and things are good. But where we have degraded and unvegetated soils, we get a rise in temperatures, and we create something called a heat island effect. And this heat island effect has profound impact on the weather. This is a temperature graph, essentially, or graphic of Atlanta in the middle of the day, and you can see the heat island effect. All that red stuff is reflecting back a huge amount of heat and creating essentially a dome over the city of Atlanta. These domes, these heat umbrellas, thwart regular precipitation over land. So what happens is we get these very hot areas, especially over urban areas. And whatever um, uh, the whatever water vapor is available over the terrestrial area doesn't condense because we don't have that nice cool surface to promote condensation. And so as a result, we have uh, we have um, less condensation from terrestrial systems, but we have a lot more energy that is being reflected back into the atmosphere. And this huge amount of energy reflected back in the atmosphere actually contributes to driving what's called the large water cycle, which is this water cycle of storms coming from the ocean. It's the ocean-driven water cycle, and that ocean-driven water cycle is going to be affected by the warming of the ocean and also this warming of the land, because the warming of the land puts more energy into the ocean-based water cycle. You can see when, I showed you Atlanta, but here we're stepping back just a little bit to say, how does this translate on a large scale? You can see when you have not just an urban area, but you can see when you step back how large these land masses can be that have these heat domes over them. And oh, by the way, look where you see the cooler temperatures. The cooler temperatures are, of course, in the mountainous areas. So that's where we have vegetation. And all the other places are, not not cool. They are contributing to the heat island effect. So if we were to fix this small water cycle, this super efficient terrestrial based water cycle, green water going up through the plants into the atmosphere and coming back down onto the land, and keeping that energy essentially over terrestrial areas, keeping terrestrial areas cool and verdant, um, this would reduce the energy that's going into the large water cycles, and as a result, reduce the energy that is contributing to these horrible storm systems that we're seeing and variable storm systems that we're seeing. So when we reduce our soil temperatures, we also reduce big infrequent storms. Now, what does it mean? It means that we have to start seeing things differently. We have to see patterns and see things that maybe we didn't notice before. And one of the things that we can start doing is treating every property as though it is a mini watershed and evaluating it based on where the water is being gathered on the property, evaluating, seeing, what is the high point of the property, which is probably a roof area, and what's the low point of the property, where does water leave our property, and everything in between the two places, the high point and the low point, we have influence on. We can manage our property, and if we managed it as though it were a mini watershed and with an intention of restoring this carbon and water cycle, we could have a huge impact, not just on our individual landscapes, but on landscapes in our community, and in fact, landscapes really in all terrestrial areas. So we have developed a series, a very simple 4 principles that we can apply to every single property and essentially improve the mini watershed that we have there. So these 4 principles are: we grow healthy living soil that acts like a sponge. We capture rainwater and we use it as a resource. So this is passive capture now. This is the difference between passive and active capture. Passive capture is in soil as opposed to in cisterns. And then third, we select climate appropriate local native plants. So plants that are really have evolved with the local soils and weather and everything else of a particular place. And then finally, we utilize highly efficient supplemental irrigation only when necessary. That means that if we need to use irrigation, it is supplemental, so it follows all of the logical sources of water, starting with rainwater and gray water and so forth. And if the system is manufactured properly, it is designed, installed, and maintained properly, and only when necessary means that we are tuned in to when a landscape actually needs supplemental water. So we're not just applying it because some timer tells us to do it. We're applying it in the quantity that's correct at the time that's correct, because we understand how the soil water root zone can be depleted and might need supplemental water. So the key technology here is living soil that acts like a sponge. And I want to say that I think this is the biggest problem with this approach. And you say, why would that be a problem? Well, the problem is this is not a device. Living soil is not something you go out and buy. This is a technique to create living soil, and being tuned in to your individual property, and the way that you create living soil on one property is going to be similar, but not exactly replicable at the next property. And so this key technology is very, very, very simple, and it's also not something you just buy as a device. And so I think that actually makes it more challenging to sell because we are, after all, consumers. Anyway, this is the key technology: spongy soil. And really, spongy soil changes everything. I wanted to show you these next two pictures because as I've gotten into more agricultural pursuits, I've learned a lot about rangeland management. This is in a desert in the Chihuahuan Desert, which borders, well, actually New Mexico and Texas and Mexico, and it might even be in Nevada. But it's a large desertified area. They get about 6 inches of rain. It's monsoonal rain, so it is in the summertime, but 6 inches is the max. Although, oh, by the way, I was just in North Dakota. They only get 6 inches of rain in North Dakota. So, it's just that, I think that's an interesting thing. Anyway, this is a southern area, 6 inches of rain. And this particular picture is from a ranch that is not managed for living soil. It's not there. The grazing techniques are not focused on building up the volume of grass and the quality of the grass and the diversity of the microbial activity in the site. The same time of year at the ranch next door, this is what it looks like. And these people are focused on living soil. And you can see big, big difference. Honestly, same place, two ranches next to each other. This ranch actually gets cloud cover over it. For different and at different times of the year when surrounding ranches don't even have cloud cover over them. So this is to me, this was a big indicator of the power of soil management and the way to manage soil in an urban environment where we don't have animals, animal integration that we are utilizing, to spark, or not, I don't want to say the word spark anymore, right? But to promote the microbial activity in the soil. In urban areas, we have to use different inputs, and the inputs that we need to use are living inputs like compost and mulch. These are the living mulch. These are the two key things, not synthetics. We need to skip weed fabrics and other things that would cover the ground and keep biological material from breaking down. We have to understand that turf is not a garden. It's just, having a grassy area needs to be a polyculture. So if we're going to have turf, it needs to look like this. It needs to be super diverse and super complex. We need to select plants that require less supplemental water. Listen, I have a property in Massachusetts. They do irrigation in Massachusetts, which I can't believe, right? Like, why? Well, because they consider a month without water a drought. So supplemental water, we need to select plants that don't require that supplemental water and really be tuned into that. Every bit of land area needs to be covered in diversity and covered in plant material. Uh, this isn't really a sacrifice. It's just about having a change in attitude. We need to slow, spread, sink, and store as much water as possible in the ground and skip the hardscape. This is I highly recommend, if you haven't read it already, this is a book that was put out just a couple of years ago. I want to say like 2019, I think. And it was put out by the United Nations water um, uh, focus on water. And it says, what are the solutions right now for clean, abundant water? Well, they are soil moisture retention, holding rainwater in the soil, and groundwater recharge. So essentially, nature-based solutions are the key. So skip the hardscape. And really, holding water in our soil sponge is critical. You only need 150 square foot area, 6 inches deep, to capture a 1 inch rain event off of 1,000 square foot of roof. And really, the first 1 or 2 inches of rain are all you need to focus on pretty much anywhere in the country, because once you build up the soil sponge, you can hold far, far more water. Your infiltration rates just skyrocket once you build that living soil. So you just concentrate on developing something that holds that first 1 or 2 inches. And you only need 150 square feet, 6 inches deep to do it, which is pretty much almost every garden has something like that. Utilizing rain barrels and cisterns to slow water down and redirect it into landscape is great. And developing plans that take advantage of natural water flows on our property so that we can really hold that water there instead of allowing it to flow off. It can look like anything. It doesn't have to look like any one particular thing. A simple swale will suffice. And it just has to capture that water and allow it to go into our soil sponge. So creating rain gardens, not so much as like a special device or some unique thing that you're doing just for stormwater capture, but really building your entire landscape around holding on to rainwater passively in the landscape is critical. If we create landscapes like this, we're actually providing multiple benefits to all of and hitting all those points for insects and birds and everything else. And on top of it, we're creating community good by improving stream flow quantity and improving water quality. So this is critical because for a lot of us, we're in areas where our stream flows, only run when we have these massive rainstorms. And what we really want is water in those streams at all times. And the way that we do that is by making sure that our green water is sufficient. And these landscapes can really look like anything. A lot of these are from a drier climate, but you can see that with these permeable hardscapes, rainwater catchment, and abundant planting, really, really lots and lots and lots of planting, and mulched with natural mulch, not stone and so forth, we are achieving something that is, that's really quite beautiful. And these rain gardens can look really like anything. Every single landscape that we do in the watershed approach has a rain garden in it. It can be long and skinny like this, or it can just be, it could even be something like this, where we have actually cut the curb. I don't know if you can see the little indentation in the foreground. This is something I hope is happening more in places like the Chesapeake Bay and places around New York and New Jersey. I know I've been to sites in those places to see curb cutting happening. It's something we're definitely doing in the West. But basically here we're cutting the curb in order to take water off the street and put it into our landscapes. This is reducing that it's improving water quality during storm events, but it's reducing the amount of water that's going into sewage systems and other stormwater systems, and of course the landscape needs it. So we're holding it in the land instead of allowing it to run over hard surfaces. So really, the essence of the watershed approach to landscaping is living soil, living roots, lots of plants, and capturing rainwater and holding it in the soil. And it's something that gardeners can do. I mean, this is the key. Like, if every single one of us focused on these principles for every garden that we build, we would have an incredible change that we could actually see in our lifetime, that we could see in 10 years. But how do we make sure that it works? Well, the first thing is we need to remember that everything is connected. And I think this is a really important thing. I love this picture. This picture is a graphic that shows how the mycorrhizal network in a forest works. So all of these little round things that you see here are trees and of various caliper sizes and various ages. And also woody shrubs. And the lines are showing how various bits of carbon have been tracked, being shared among this network of plants. And so when we begin to look at a forest and we see that indeed, you know, this system is an incredibly integrated and an incredibly interdependent system, we can step back and say, all right, let's mimic that in our land work. Let us not, you know, it's simple answers, but let's think about it as complex systems where we are really trying to tie as many things together as we possibly can. Also, when we spend money, just as human beings, I'm not even talking now about, you know, necessarily in a landscape, but when we spend money, let's support a regenerative economy. That means that we are actually looking at everything we do through this lens of regeneration. We're saying, okay, every choice that we make is going to have some way that we are regenerating the earth. And really beginning to think about the purchases that we make and the decisions that we make of things that we do in a much more connected way. And really, you know, imagining not just, you know, satisfying a convenience, but thinking about what are the implications of the things that we do. Everything from the clothing and fabrics that we buy, the cosmetics that we buy, the food certainly that we buy, you know, looking for regenerative labeling, looking for, you know, truly local food as much as possible. And gardening like the earth depends on it, you know, using these practices, focusing on these issues, because, you know, it does. It's that simple. Okay, I have a shameless self-promotion here, and that is that we, as was mentioned by Peggy, we are an EPA WaterSense certifying organization, and we have a certification called the Watershed Wise Landscape Professional. It's online, 100% asynchronistic. You go online, you log in, and you track it and do it in your own pace. And it's at watershedwisetraining.com. This is how you reach me.
That was fantastic, Pamela. That was amazing. I learned so much. I want to plant my own rain garden now so that I can at least just do my thing here.
For sure. Every garden should be a rain garden, like the
Right,
whole
exactly.
thing. Not just the little slice, but the whole thing.
You make me, your presentation made me optimistic for our future, made me hopeful for our future. If we all do this together, we will make a difference.
I'm so glad. That's not always the response, so I'm very delighted to see that. I'd be happy to take questions. I know I'm running up against my time, but I'd love to. I'm happy to take questions if people want to stay.
Anybody have any questions? You can feel free to unmute yourself or post it into the chat. Lindy Higgins, you feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question.
I actually was just going to make a comment that this was an excellent presentation, and I agree, it does give some hope for the future and really sheds more light on how everything's connected and how the ecosystem is basically everything. So I just want to thank you.
Thanks, Lindy.
Hi, it's Kathy from Chesapeake Bay. And I just wanted to say that I really like the idea of this local water cycling, and that example that you showed of the farms in Mexico. I am going to tell my neighbors about your idea of the cuts in the sidewalk. We don't have sidewalks, we don't have gutters, but we just have like asphalt roads. And we were noticing that a lot of water was rushing down the road, and our house is kind of down a hill. And we were getting it from both sides, rushing in to our property. So we asked if a couple of cuts could be cut from the road into the dirt. And then they just put some big, I don't know if it's called riprap, anyway, big rocks. And it was amazing. We really have noticed a significant difference, and it didn't cost much. It wasn't hard to do. It was quick and easy. So I think that's what I'll recommend. We live right on a ravine with a little stream that goes into the bay, and the neighborhood has, I think, 10 of them. So if we could all do this and keep that water from, and then what we're doing on our yard is turning it into a meadow. I'll promote that too, but thank you. This was great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kathy. Yeah, I'm particularly optimistic for the Chesapeake Bay watershed. I used to live in Pennsylvania, so
You
I was directly
get it.
connected to that.
Great.
But also, I have friends who used to be a friend in particular who used to be at the University or Arizona State and is now in Maryland and is doing a lot of really great work. But yes, this intervening onto hard surfaces, especially community hard surfaces, like in our case, the curbs, but also, as you say, the roadways. If there are driveway aprons that come down onto roadways, intervening there and finding ways to divert water back onto the landscape instead of allowing it to go out to the street. These are huge, and just a few of them in a neighborhood make an enormous difference.
Amazing.
And improve water quality dramatically, and also benefit, the individual landscapes. So thank you so much for talking about that.
Thanks.
Yeah, just a quick comment. So I went out on a limb last year and built 2 rain gardens because I wanted to, I guess, try it out before. I am a landscape architect, before I try to convince any clients. And then this summer, being so dry, I realized that my rain gardens were the best looking planting beds of my garden. And I was thinking, this is really how to promote it. It's not so much, it's not only a stormwater solution, it is it's a free resource. So I can't quite put it in good words yet, but for people to understand that they don't need irrigation, and that allows them to grow other plants that they otherwise wouldn't be able to sustain in their garden unless they used irrigation. I don't know. This may be so duh for a lot of you, but for me that was so eye-opening. So I'm so excited to hear you promoting it, or having been promoting it. Anyway, that was just a little comment of mine. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bianca. One of the things that I didn't really get to or get at, but that you're introducing here, is the fact that, the idea is that the whole garden is a rain garden. And so we concentrate on doing very, very shallow depressions, and many of them in the landscape. So there's no flat yard anymore. That's really like the key. That even if it's just a grass area, it's not flat. It has depressions in it. And we are considering where the water would be coming from, and we are moving it around the landscape so that we are spreading it out as much as possible and slowing it down and allowing it to sink in various areas, not just one. One of the challenges that I encountered, I did a lot of work with an organization called Surfrider Foundation. We actually helped them create ocean-friendly gardens. And so I spent a lot of time on the East Coast looking at rain gardens. And so much of the regulation around rain gardens was, of course, stormwater, 100-year event storms. And so these enormous excavations, very deep, replacing the soil with engineered soil so that it could percolate faster, to go down into groundwater, and just, like really engineered solutions. And, that's fine, I guess, except that I think it's a missed opportunity. First of all, it's much more costly. Secondly, it turns this into like a device, right? That you have to have really specialized knowledge to do. Instead, if you apply the watershed approach, you're just making a garden that is focused on building healthy living soil everywhere, having small depressions around the landscape that are capturing that water, and tuning into the cycles of the type of plants that really thrive without supplemental irrigation and that can thrive on that rainwater. But those first two things, the soil, living soil, planting abundantly, so lots of plants, and making sure that we're capturing that rainwater, that's the secret. And it's not expensive to do in comparison with these engineered solutions. And you're not creating some special engineered soil mix. You're not removing, you're not doing excavation and removing. These solutions are 6 inches deep. They're not massive. And that is because, and we're capturing the same volume. And that is because what we're doing is we're changing the structure of the soil, not relying on a particle size to produce our better infiltration. We're relying on aggregation of that soil to produce better infiltration. And that's a thing that I think landscape architects and landscape and engineers, civil engineers, and people who are like really making the rules around rain gardens could spend a little more time thinking about is, how could we harness soil structure to our benefit? Soil structure is something most of us did not learn about in school. And really, believe me, I spent all this time now with farmers, and they have advanced degrees, PhDs in many cases, and they never talked about soil structure. Soil structure was not on the radar, but yet soil structure is what makes soil work. It is the key to everything. Yeah, I think that turning landscapes into these, multiple rain gardens is a really great thing. I'm so glad you had a good experience with your rain garden, and I want to encourage you to, get even more experimental.
Pamela, if you
definitely.
have a chance to answer one more question
Sure.
from Mark and Andrea Loberts. When installing gardens on depleted soils in urban settings, even from under old asphalt, what specific steps might you recommend? Special soils maybe, or special wood chips from young trees and branches maybe? Or what do you suggest to build living soil? And then follow up maintenance practices to support those soils best.
Okay, so look, the cool thing is that plants build their own soil. So what we really need to do is, the first thing is as little disturbance as possible. So that's number one. Certainly if you have to take up asphalt, I mean, that's disturbance, right? But we call, we actually, I should have said this, I encourage you all to go on our website, greengardensgroup.com. We have all these books that we've done mostly for the West, but they are all relevant everywhere. So pick the one that you like. Marin County, for example, would be it's a pretty that they get a lot of rainfall in Marin. You could click on their book and download it. It has a lot of very step-by-step stuff in it. But we call this OWL, oxygen, water, and life. So the first thing is, yes, you may need to disturb the soil initially to, in an urban setting, to get oxygen into the soil. That could be tilling. Oh God, I hate tilling because it destroys everything. right? But you might need to do it in order to get oxygen if you don't have time, especially. But once you disturb the soil, you are actually disturbing weed seeds. You're going to be getting a lot of forbs growing in that situation, because those plants are going to try to start healing that soil as soon as you disturb it. So the next thing you have to do is get some good compost down on it. And good compost, really completely decomposed compost, but very little, like a 1/4 inch of compost is plenty just to get things going. And then planting. And planting really without, you don't need, you don't need to add any kinds of like gypsum or lime or any of that stuff to the soil. You simply need to get that compost layer down, plant as best that you can, and then cover it with living mulch. And the best living mulch, as you mentioned, is live wood chip mulch. So wood chip mulch that has branches, leaves, so it's wood, and it's like green and brown. You're basically composting, right, on the ground. And in our books, we have a strategy for sheet composting or sheet mulching, which I know many of you are familiar with. That is an excellent way, if you have time, to build the soil before you plant without disturbance. So there are a couple of different ways to go, but really it's a focus on getting those roots in the ground and getting some compost down and covering it with good living mulch. Because the microbes on the living mulch will actually, they are food for the apex predators in the soil, like earthworms and other things, will come up into that mulch and start to incorporate that mulch into the soil, which is, which is how passages get opened up and all that sort of stuff. So that's how you begin to oxygenate the soil. And that plant, once it's in the ground, it will start immediately, taking that carbon out of the atmosphere and working to build its environment. So plant as much as you possibly can, and that's the best way to go. Hopefully that was helpful. So a couple of different strategies, but all coming to the same thing. Maintenance. What did you want me to talk about with maintenance? I mean, I am a very lazy landscaper. I wasn't when I first started, but now I am. I think the number one thing that we can do in landscapes is to embrace forbs and understand the role that they play in a landscape. Now, forbs are what many people will call weeds. It's important for us to realize that those plants they are there for a reason. They are actually contributing to the soil fertility and the structure of that soil, and that's why you have them there. And so I've gotten very tolerant of forbs in my landscape, especially when it's young, because in a landscape that's young, forbs are going to be the dominant plant form. Like in nature, that's what you see dominantly, that those brassicas are going to be the very first thing that you see. And then over time, woody plants will replace those forbs. So I've kind of gotten really tolerant, and I've also no longer pull out weeds, because when you pull out one of those guys, you're disturbing soil. I do a lot of coppicing to keep roots in the ground, to keep as much organic matter on site as possible. So those are some of the maintenance things. I don't know. I have very,
You should
specific.
probably define coppicing for people.
Oh, I'm sorry. Coppicing is literally cutting off a head. But what you're doing is you're essentially cutting the plant at the soil interface. So you're cutting off all of the plant, but you're leaving the roots in the soil. And the thing is that there are a couple of really taproot centric, they're the decompaction guys, like I'm trying to think of one, like dandelions are a great example of a decompactor. They're there to put oxygen in your soil, get that soil broken up, and they've got those enormous taproots. So those plants are going to have energy in the roots. They will come back with green on top for a couple of times. And if you cut them at the base, eventually you will deplete that taproot of its energy and it will no longer be able to put up those leaves. Other forbs don't have those structures. When you cut off their solar panels, they don't have any way to continue to build their their bodies. And so they will essentially die. But the key is that the roots are still in the ground. And why is that important? It's important because we want those roots are organic matter that the soil microbial community can decompose and essentially utilize to create a better soil structure for the plant that you want to be there. So coppicing forbs at the base is it's a better way. Once you disturb that soil by pulling out that plant and removing the roots from the soil, you've disturbed it. And now what happens? Another forb comes to try to fix it. So you basically, just increase the number of weeds that you're going to have in your landscape when you pull them out. So we really want to keep the soil covered, and we want to keep as much living root in the ground as possible, and then as much organic matter on the site as possible. We could talk.
Thank you,
We can
Pamela.
go into a lot of different things. So I'm sorry. I took a macro approach on this one. I'd be happy to come back next year and do something a little bit more micro if you're interested, talking about cover cropping and so forth in urban settings. Would love to talk to you, and I want to encourage you to grab one of our books off the website and join us for one of our trainings. And thank you so much for this opportunity. It was great to talk to you. I'm sorry we didn't even have more time for more questions, because I love to hear from you guys.
Thank you, Pamela. And I will take you up on that. We will be in touch with you.
Super.
Great.
Thank you.
And I hope everybody will join me in thanking Pamela for I've learned so much. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Bravo. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great, what is it? It's day. It's nighttime here.